Good morning. I just woke up, hence the rebel and the sort of untamed hair. I woke up a little later than I usually do. Um, since I started my new job, I got a new job. It's very exciting. But I used to work nights and now I'm working days. So it's been a bit of a shift. See when you're working nights, and you can sort of wake up sort of at whatever hour you kind of want to. I tended to wake up around 11:30, a lot later on in the day. But since I was switching over to mornings, now that I'm working, it's sort of 9 to 5 ish, getting there at 8 9, something like that. Depends on the day. I tend to wake up more around that 5:30 6 a.m. mark, which is quite the adjustment. It's definitely not as bad as, say, if you went to, say, mornings, or I guess the land of the living, really, from working overnights. I've done that before. That was fun, but it's definitely still an adjustment, sort of shifting over your sleep schedule, especially when, I suppose, if you've been on a sleep schedule long enough, you kind of become accustomed to life going on in those particular hours. So it's definitely been a bit of an adjustment. And I find myself that during the week or whenever it is that I'm working, I tend to be all right. I can wake up 5:30, 6ish, go to bed, 10, 11, whatever it may be. But during any stretch of time off, I find myself reverting back to my old sleep schedule. And it'll probably take a while, I think, to get fully on over. But there's definitely still that part of your life that still operates, I guess, on that world, that waking world later on into the night. But what happens is, say, on Sunday or the day right before you're going back into work, you have two options. You can either get into bed at the appropriate hour and you can't sleep, or you just go to bed at your normal, your old normal, I suppose, hour, and then you're just groggy, really, the next day because you only got maybe 3 4 hours of sleep. But I've been trying to be good. I've been trying to be better. So I would get into bed at the appropriate hour, but I find myself just laying there, not being able to fall asleep. There's nothing quite like hopping in bed and you still got energy. You could still go for hours. But I find that during this time, your mind sort of starts to wander. And the thing about hopping in a bed when you're not tired or you can't sleep, you start thinking about every single thing that ever happened in your life. And that usually doesn't go to the greatest place, really. I could be making a pretty big overall generalization here, but I feel like that tends to be the course. But during those times of thinking all of the time, I started thinking about something else. See, every decision that you make or I make, there's a lot of changes going on personally in my life right now. But every thought that I suppose passes through my head, um, I realize it's not really just in my mind. It doesn't just stop there. It sort of extends beyond into your life as thoughts do. They sort of carry through to your actions and whatnot. And it sort of has that power in a way to shape the reality that I live inside, that you live inside, right? So I'm not much of a religious or a spiritual person. I think I was a lot more when I was younger, and I'm not right now. I think that happens a lot for people if they grow up, I suppose, in a religious or a spiritual household. There comes a point, sort of as they're growing up, and this happened for me, where you sort of step away from that. You have to find your own way, whether that's, I don't know, God, some higher power, whatever it is, connection with something. I think you take a step back, and if it's meant to be or if you want it to be, you end up finding that later in life. I think I've seen that firsthand, excuse me, with my parents. I think sort of they grew up, different religions growing up for them. They met, they didn't, and then later on in life where they are now, they found their God, or their spiritual reawakening, I suppose you could say. But regardless, point is I'm not right now. I'm also not much of a neuroscientist, a psychologist, or involved in quantum physics in any way, shape, or form. That being said, I started seeing a couple of these discussions pop up online about what exactly thoughts are and their potential implications, which prompted me to sit down and talk to you. And today we're going to explore how thoughts, yours and mine, can sort of change our reality, and how that relates to, neuroscience, psychology, and a little bit of quantum mechanics, I suppose. And then we can see that philosophers thought about all this, the great thinkers that they are, long ago, long before, we came up with a name to associate or categorize any of this. But first I want to acknowledge that sort of the idea of changing your reality through purely and strictly thought can quickly be associated with clearance section self-help books, or sort of that wishy-washy wishful thinking. So I want to set a baseline here before we go any further that no, although it would be cool, you won't be able to bend spoons with your mind or phase through walls, anything like that. I know that would be quite cool, and I'm sorry, it might be a bit of a letdown. But thoughts, I believe, can still shape the reality that you live inside and that I live inside. So I think it's a great point to start, going way back from when we first sort of realized that we are who we are, and started acknowledging things going on in the world around us, and sort of realizing, I guess, that the world is, for the most part, pretty solid and predictable. A table is a table. You can go into your kitchen or your dining room, or anywhere, I suppose, and you can look at a table. You can walk around said table. It has 4 legs, a tabletop. You can put things on it. For all intents and purposes, it is a table. Now, rocks are also rocks. I know. You can go outside, you can find a rock. You can pick it up, you can hold it, it looks like a rock. If you took that rock and you threw it at a tree, there's a good chance that it would then hit that tree. That is the universe as described by Sir Isaac Newton. The world, rather, is mechanical. It's ordered and it is determined. But if we fast forward a little bit from the days of Sir Isaac Newton, around the early 20th century, there were these physicists. You might know some of them. Physicists like Bohr, Heisenberg, not the New Mexico blue crystal one. I feel like he sort of took center stage in the Heisenberg fame, but the other one, as well as Einstein. They started seeing something strange going on, sort of down at the atomic level, and there was nowhere where this was stranger than in something called the double slit experiment. Now, basically, what the double slit experiment was is if you fire tiny particles, say electrons, at a barrier, just imagine a wall, right? You fire it at a barrier with 2 slits in it, say one on the left, one on the right. You'd expect those tiny particles, those electrons, to sort of behave like marbles. You'd fire at the wall and they would essentially go in one slit or the other. They'd make that choice, left or right, or whatever it is, right? Instead, what happened is when they did this, those electrons, they went through both at the same time. This populated an interference pattern on the other side. It was sort of like a wave. If you've ever seen a wave crash over something, it doesn't just divert itself going one way. It ends up going cresting and sort of funneling out into both possible options. So this interference pattern on the other side, they saw this and they noticed that these electrons, they didn't go in one or the other. They ended up being in multiple places at the same time. Excuse me. Which is kind of strange. If you think that's weird, it's probably good. They also thought that it was pretty weird. So they decided that they were going to measure it. They were going to set a detector up, which they did, and they were going to try to figure out where these electrons went. The thing is that once they set a detector up, the electrons, they didn't behave like a wave anymore. That interference pattern disappeared and they ended up behaving more like marbles. They made that choice. They went to the left slit or the right slit. They went one or the other. They chose, really. The electrons now chose a single path. And basically what they saw from this is that until measurement, until they set the detector up, those particles existed in something called a probability distribution. In essence, it was this cloud, really, of potential. Not here nor there, but both. They only became real, per se, once some sort of interaction forced them to make a decision. Now, Einstein hated this. He said that God does not play dice with the universe, to which Bohr responded with and saying, "Einstein, stop telling God what to do." Now, turns out, a little later on, we figured out that Bohr was probably right. In reality, the foundation of reality, really, uncertainty and probability are sort of baked into the very fabric. Now, this isn't just about subatomic particles, but before we make a decision in life, the future, our future, your future, my future, it represents this cloud of possibilities. If you decide to move to a new city, if you decide to take a new job or ask someone out, all of those possible futures exist in possibility and in potential. You live in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in New York, in Nova Scotia, wherever it is. You live in all those places in that cloud, right? The moment that you choose, though, that wave collapses. It's sort of like Schrodinger's cat, in a way. And this is sort of what Heisenberg, again, not the one who knocks, but the other one, meant when describing the uncertainty principle. You see, you can't know everything at once. And the more precisely you know one aspect, say the position of a particle, the less you know about another, say the momentum of that particle. And life is the same way. The future is never fully knowable, and you can only see the outcome once it's happened, once it's acted. Now, Kierkegaard had a quote, and I did write this one down, but Kierkegaard, I think, said it best. They said, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forward." Now, if the double slit experiment, if it revealed uncertainty, then entanglement, rather, shows connection. See, quantum entanglement is when two particles, they interact, right? They interact in a certain way and they become entangled. Essentially, their states are linked. So no matter how far away they are, if you change one, the other reflects. This is what a lot of, if you've ever seen all the quantum teleportation sort of research that's been coming out, it's kind of been hitting in the news channels and circulating online. I believe, could be wrong, but I do believe that they were just able to have an experiment in some way that actually had quantum teleportation. I believe this was in quantum computation, which is really interesting stuff. But regardless, that's not the point. The point is, what does any of this have to do with us? It means that the universe, is not built on separate and independent pieces, but rather it's built out of relationships. And this is sort of how thoughts work too. They don't, again, like I said earlier, they don't stop at the border of your skull. You don't just think a thought and it's just in that confined vacuum. It affects words, body language, and choices that you and I make. Those then go on to affect the people around us. The effects go on. A single thought, whether that's resentment or kindness or really whatever else you're thinking, that cascades through a network of people. And in that sense, humans, right, we're kind of entangled too. Now, you might be thinking, what the hell is even a thought? At its most basic, a thought is just a burst of electrochemical activity in the brain. It's neurons communicating, and they fire these electric signals across these tiny gaps called synapses. And when millions of them fire together, they start creating these rhythmic sort of patterns that you might know, and that I more commonly know as brain waves. You can see these on an EEG, which stands for electroencephalogram. You don't need to know that, but if you've ever seen Stranger Things, or maybe you've used one or been hooked up to one yourself, it's all these wires. They're sort of on top of your head. They're all hooked into your mind. But they basically measure electrical activity in the brain. So then, if you take that thought and you think about it, thoughts are really just energy. They're frequencies, they're oscillations of charged particles, patterns of energy flickering through living tissue. Which is kind of interesting to think about. But these thoughts are not just, passing sort of sparks firing off. They leave marks. Every time that you think a thought, the neural pathway responsible for it gets reinforced based on what you think. If you practice gratitude, for example, the circuits for gratitude then become reinforced. If you think about fear, or if you're scared a lot, the fear circuit then grows dominant. That's called neuroplasticity. And there's this psychologist named Donald Hebb, and he said that neurons that fire together wire together. And basically, right, over time, thoughts start to sculpt the architecture of our brain. They bias what we notice, what we ignore, what we believe is possible. This starts to shape our reality a little bit more directly. Once your brain is rewired by repeated thought, the world that we live in starts to change around it. We don't experience the same reality as someone whose brain is rewired completely different than our own. Now, the science alone may be compelling. It is for me, but it may resonate, say, a little bit more, not because of what Hebb or what Bohr said, but philosophers across time brought all of this up long before physics or neuroscience or psychology sort of caught up. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus said, and again, I wrote this one down. Epictetus said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our opinions about them." You see, he was sort of describing, in a way, cognitive bias, centuries before psychology formalized it. Now, William James, the very father of modern psychology, wrote, and I wrote this one down as well, James said, "The greatest discovery of my generation is that a human being can alter his life by altering his attitude." Which is great. It's a great concept, but this sort of was realized a little bit before James was alive. That attitudes are patterns of thought. Now, even Einstein, though very skeptical of mystical claims, even noted that reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. So, where does all of this leave us, right? First, no, thoughts do not have the power to warp the fabric of space and time. You can't sit in your room and think of a chair into existence. You can't materialize it in front of you. At least you can't right now. Who knows? Maybe in 50 years, things will change. I wouldn't necessarily be surprised, so maybe. But right now, what it does mean is that reality is probabilistic and relational. None of it is really fixed. Thoughts are physical energy that reshape your brain, and your brain then shapes how your reality is perceived and navigated. Those choices then can collapse potential into lived outcomes, and then those ripple outwards into others in patterns of connection that sort of resembles entanglement. In that sense, then, the thoughts really do have sort of the power then to change reality, not through breaking any laws of physics, really, but by working within their confines. They change you, and through you, change the world that you inhabit. Now, Kierkegaard, again, he warned that despair is not knowing yourself. Stoics urged the mastery of perception. In Eastern traditions like Buddhism, they taught that the mind creates the world that we live in. Through various cultures and time, that sort of insight has been repeated. Reality is filtered. Reality is filtered, constructed, and steered by thought. Quantum science and neuroscience would provide that mechanism, and philosophy provides meaning to it. Together, they tell us that the universe is built on all of this uncertainty and connection and potential, and thought is then that instrument through which we navigate all of it. Put simply, everything is potential, and thought is where it collapses and your reality begins.